Francis Fukuyama caused a stir 3 years ago in a book called The End of History. He argued that democratic capitalism is the ultimate political system and the winner of a historical conflict of ideologies. Now, in a new book called Trust, he argues that social capital will become the chief determinant in a nation's struggle for economic success. Joining me now, the author of Trust, Francis Fukuyama. Welcome. It's great to have you back.
Thank you.
Let me just get at this idea, because the end of history caused a great deal of stir, because people looked at the victory of capitalism, or the victory primarily of democracy, and you looked at it and said, this is the end of history. One of the giant struggles of our time has come to an end. It's the end of history. In a sense, that great struggle is over, and it signifies something. Now you seem to be saying that what we now look to is not economic success or economic determinants defined in a traditional way, but a new set of values that will determine what nations become the most economically successful.
That's right.
What are those determinants?
Well, you know, in a certain sense, we have the skeleton of the skyscraper, which is, you know, our democratic capitalist order. And, you know, really what the end of history means is that that skeleton is in place, and there's no amount of social engineering that's really going to make the building firmer, bigger, or better. But within that skeleton, you have living human beings, and one of the most important characteristics is, you know, what I call social capital, the ability of people to work together, to cooperate, to trust one another in social groups, because virtually everything we do in life is based on the cooperation of individuals. We're really not individualistic in the way that, you know, Americans think of ourselves. And I think that in the global economy, this is a characteristic that's very much underrated by economists as a factor determining who's going to come out ahead.
Okay. Let's look at different countries as a good way to understand what you're talking about. The countries that you cite as having a high level of trust: Japan, the United States, and Germany.
That's right.
Those countries that have low trust, interestingly, France, Italy, China. People would look at that and say, well, it seems that China and Japan would have more similar values than China and the United States, or than Japan and the United States. How do you define which country has trust?
Well, the paradox about China really is a paradox about family values, because in a certain sense you can have a society that has very strong families, whose families in a way are too strong, that the only relationships, social relationships that lead to social trust are relationships with kin. And that's exactly what happens in China, or for that matter in certain European countries like France and Italy, where families are, you know, the complete social horizon, but strangers that aren't related to each other have difficulty working with each other. And what's quite you know, remarkable and counterintuitive is that in many ways Japan and the United States, that are usually put at opposite ends of the pole, as, you know, one being very group-oriented and one being very individualistic, are actually quite similar in regard to the ability of people not related to one another to work together easily, to trust one another, and to come together in spontaneous groups.
What's another interesting observation is about that you have seen. If you look at Germany on the one hand, essentially a nation that has had long periods of high authority, in authoritarianism in its government, and has Japan. Yet you find on the factory floor, you argue,
that's right,
more liberalization and independence than you do on the factory floors of the United States. Why is that?
Well, it's a funny paradox, but in these countries they're more egalitarian. You know, for example, teams have been the big buzzword in American management. Instead of having a complex division of labor and lots of bosses and managers and hierarchies, you trust people, you know, the guys that do the actual assembly, to work out the assembly process, and they talk among themselves and that sort of thing. And that actually has been done in both Japan and Germany for you know, many years before it became a trendy.
Now, does that have something to do with that their manufacturing capability was destroyed by the war, and therefore they had to rebuild it?
I don't think it has to do with that. It comes from their culture, basically. And my argument actually is that it's not something foreign to American culture at all. I think this highly stratified factory is really a kind of innovation of the mid-20th century. But in fact, Americans, you know, also had that kind of approach to social organization that got off on the wrong track during the century. And in fact, if you look at corporate America over the last 10 or 15 years, you've seen the reintroduction of all of these concepts of team and flattening the organization, eliminating managerial hierarchies, devolving authority to the people that actually do the manufacturing and the production. And this, I think, in a way, is a coming home of a kind of, it comes naturally to Americans.
Some of the things you say in here about America will offend two groups of people at very different places in the society in terms of attitude. On the one hand, when you argue that Americans are not that individualistic in terms of their proclivity to join groups, because we all think of ourselves as the most individualistic of nations and people. Yes?
That's absolutely right. Americans are convinced that they're the most individualistic society in the world, but in fact, throughout our entire history, we have been joiners, in terms of schools, hospitals, universities, churches, unions, neighborhood, community groups. This has been, every observer of the United States, particularly someone like Tocqueville, who came from France, which is at the other end of the spectrum, in that respect, has noticed that about the United States, that for all our self-proclaimed individualism, we actually work together, very well in groups. We like cohering, and in fact, we like, conforming to broader social norms.
On the other end, you argue that the seeds of the dissension within our social capital comes from our push for individualism within certain parts of our society and from our cultural differences and some sense of respect for those cultural differences. You suggest that part of the problem is the problem we see in the inner cities with young African Americans, right?
Well, that's a symptom of the problem. I mean, I would say that, we've undergone a very big cultural revolution in the last couple of generations where, at mid-century you had a fairly conformist society, where people sought to, be part of the mainstream. In a way, you've had a rights revolution in which virtually every form of authority from the family all the way up to the nation, has been questioned as a legitimate or morally right. And I think, what you've seen in this country, in a way, is a real rise of a genuine kind of individualism of a sort that we always said we had, but we never, really had.
But you see that as threatening.
Well, I think it's a real problem for us because, just to take economics, anything from a dry cleaning business to making the latest generation microprocessor is not the result of the work of individuals. It's the result of organizations and groups. And unless people can trust one another and work within those groups, you have tremendous inefficiencies. If you don't trust one another, you have to bureaucratize, you have to set a lot of formal rules, you have to regulate everything by central authority, and that's not, an efficient way of doing things.
But if you take a society that has an assortment of groups of people, and the immigration policies that we have had in this country, in which we have tried to assimilate everyone,
right?
Aren't we more sensitive to assimilation than most other countries in the world?
Oh, no, we've done a tremendous job at assimilation, and I think that, in a way, that's what's changed.
In many ways, we have been the melting pot.
We have been, but the ideology is different now. The ideology has become much more multiculturalist in the last, few years, so that instead of the public school system trying to mold, immigrants into a common framework with a common set of values by which they can communicate, we teach immigrants to, in some sense, preserve, that traditional
Preserve
culture.
and respect and be sensitive to your own heritage.
That's right, and the result is, just in terms of language, you can't communicate, across these cultural boundaries, and I think that is a real problem in terms of social capital, because it's going to mean that people can only collaborate, along these ethnic lines or racial lines or group lines.
When I looked at those countries also that you don't find a strong sense of social capital, many of them were former communist countries, where there was a level of distrust for institutions as well. Russia, China, still a communist country, and other parts of Eastern Europe.
That's right. See, I think there's a very important lesson, for us in that. All of those countries went through a period in which they had a very strong centralized state that basically undercut all of these, different organizations, intermediate institutions in society, and left their populations with a kind of, it depleted social capital, left populations that couldn't collaborate, and then...
Yet it did not extinguish the fire and the thirst for democracy.
Oh, no, that's right. That's right. But you can have...
Especially in Eastern Europe.
That you can have democracy without having, all these, without having social capital, but democracy does not work nearly as well. Capitalism doesn't work as well, and democracy doesn't work as well unless people, can in some sense be self-organizing so that they can form political parties, interest groups, all of the various organizations that make up a modern democracy.
But is it, in the end, your thesis is if you look at Asia, the economy of Japan has a stronger likelihood of being successful in the next century than the economy of China?
Well, I'll give you one example. Wang Laboratories, which is really the only Chinese brand name that any Americans are familiar with. It was founded in Lowell, Massachusetts by a Chinese immigrant from Shanghai. It grew to be one of the big Route 128 computer makers by the early 1980s. And it fell apart for a typically Chinese reason, that the founder of the company, An Wang, when he wanted to step down, instead of turning the company over to his American, vice president that everyone expected on merits to get it, turned it over to his son, Fred. Right. And the company, went into bankruptcy within 4 years of that. And that is an absolutely typical Chinese phenomenon. Because social capital resides only in the family, it's very hard to break out of these family units. And that is one thing that the Japanese mastered, way before they even industrialized, was the ability to create, more impersonal, larger...
No nepotism.
That's right. That's right.
The book is called Trust: The Social Virtues and the Creation of Prosperity. Francis Fukuyama, you remember him from The End of History, a controversial book some 3 years ago. This book likely to create an equivalent amount of controversy because it seems to push at the strongly held views of a lot of people on many sides of the political spectrum. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.